think you're muted now. Okay, so we're in Zechariah chapter 6, and as we've been going through Zechariah, there's still so much more to cover in the book. I think we have like maybe 8 more chapters so to look at in the book. But we're finishing up today the 8th vision that Zechariah had. So there were a series of 8 visions that were there in Zechariah. Today we're covering the 8th vision. We started in chapter 1, and we've made our way through. Today we come to the 6th and the final. I'm sorry, the 8th and the final vision of Zechariah. It's found in the 6th chapter of Zechariah, and all the visions that have come to pass so far, and the messages that God has been sending to His people through Zechariah to be able to encourage them in the work of rebuilding the temple, because this is a very precarious situation that they're in. It doesn't seem like they can go forward because there's the threat of the Samaritans trying to stop the work. There is the prospect of the king maybe not willing to go forward. The people are becoming sidetracked. Those are some of the internal and the external things that are taking place. And also they're thinking that this is the time to go forth and build. And God is saying, no, this is the time to go forth and to build. I'm going to make a way out. And He's beginning to show how this will take place through the revelations that Zechariah is receiving. As we saw them unfolding from chapter 1 to hitherto, we saw some similarities in some of the visions, and particularly as related to the book of Revelation. We have not had quizzes thus far where I've gone through and had different points and so forth for you to choose from. However, I think it'd probably only be appropriate maybe next week to have some type of quiz. I guess this would be like an examination, because we haven't had quizzes up to this point, but an examination as to the main ideas and the meanings behind these visions from chapter 1 to chapter 8. That said, we're going to go into chapter 6 rather, and see this 8th vision that is given, because they had meaning for then. And we've seen some of the parallels to the book of Revelation, or I shouldn't say parallels, perhaps it may be more fitting to say we've seen some of the similarities between some of Zechariah and some of the book of Revelation. And today is not going to be any different from some of the previous chapters that we have looked at, in that we are going to see a reminder of just that. So I'm going to open up, and I'm going to give this a shot. Hopefully this will work for us until my computer comes back on, and when it does, then we'll be able to look at it. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to see this in its entirety. So we're looking at the topic of 4 chariots and a crown, and I can't see you anymore because I've changed over on screens and so forth, and literally working off of my phone. So hopefully you can see this. If you can't see it, I'll say speak now. If you ever hold your peace, I'll try to get it fixed real quick. Otherwise, you're probably going to be lost, because most of the time I'm going to have the presentation on versus speaking. So hopefully you can see that. Is everyone able to see? Can someone maybe say something, because I can't hear or see? Rather, I can hear, but I can't see.
I can see it.
I can
Awesome.
see it too.
Cool. All right, great. All right, so and you're without even looking at this, I know I invited you to Zechariah chapter 6, but if you turn over to Revelation chapter 6 very quickly, Revelation chapter 6 is where we start from today. Revelation, the 6th chapter, and beginning in the 1st verse, because otherwise the picture that you see on your screen really won't make any sense to you what you're looking at. And again, thank you for confirming that. Well, you have a couple of different horses and riders there in the book of Revelation. Sometimes in the Apocalypse, it's called the 4 horsemen. And these horsemen are different colors, and they carry with them different emblems. And the first one is a white horse. The second one is a red, and followed by a black, and then a pale horse. Now, in the book of Revelation, the 6th chapter, starting in verse 1, Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, "Now when I saw, when the Lamb had opened one of the seals, that I heard a loud voice from the 4 living creatures saying, like a voice of thunder, 'Come and see,' or 'Behold, look, come and see.' And he looked, and behold, it was a white horse, and he that sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer." And so this first horse opens up, and corresponding to the first seal. And he's riding forth on a white horse with a bow, conquering and to conquer. The following verses, I will not read, but from verse 3 down to verse 7, describe the other horses and the other seals, the opening of the seals and the other horses. So that essentially the first seal opens up and it has a white horse. The second seal opens up, it has a red horse. The third seal opens, it has a black horse. And the fourth opens and it has a pale horse. And that's what we see in the book of Revelation, the final book of the Bible. these four horses going through, and they have these riders on them, and the riders have various emblems. The first one had a bow, the second one had a sword, the third one had a scale, and so forth, to go in and to measure the wheat and the barley and so forth. And then the fourth one came through in verse I think 7, so forth. And this was described as one that had a pale horse, and that he was given to him to bring forth with the sword and the hunger and to bring death upon people. Much has been written about these four horses in the apocalypse. Somebody's maybe unmuted. So if you're unmuted, if you would mute yourself. Thank you. Much has been made about these four horsemen in the apocalypse and what the symbolism represents and what they mean. We look at the white horse, and we know that just in a nutshell, that the white horse represented purity. The red one represented bloodshed. The black represented the apostasy and the destruction that will come into the church. The fourth one represented the time period of the persecution going into the dark ages and so forth that was seen. And so we have really a corrupting feature of the church going from a pure to persecution to apostasy and then to death. Really the four stages that you had that took place in the church from the first rider going all the way down. So we'd see the church triumphant, and then we see it being persecuted. We see apostasy entering in. And then lastly, we see in death and grave and Hades coming in. Those things are being pictured in the book of Revelation. Those are the first four seals of the book of Revelation, again, corresponding to the four horses. Now, without further ado, we'll go back to the book of Zechariah, the 6th chapter. Zechariah, the 6th chapter, and starting in verse 1. Zechariah chapter 6, and starting in verse 1. There, Zechariah chapter 6, starting in verse 1, we read the following. It says, "And then I turned and I raised my eyes and looked, behold, there were four chariots that were coming from between two mountains, and the mountains were bronze or brass. The first chariot were red horses, and the second were black horses. With the third chariot were white horses, and with the fourth chariot they were dappled, or you may see gray and spotted. Strong horses or strong steeds." So on the screen, you see the picture there, maybe what this looked like, coming from two mountains. And the mountains were brass. And these horses were white, red, black, and then dappled or gray and speckled. We've already read from the book of Revelation, and so we know. From Revelation, I'm trying to turn my slide off and come back to you. There we go. All right. So from the book of Revelation, we already know that there is a similarity, right? Because in Revelation, we see four horses. In Zechariah, we look now and we also see four chariots coming out, or four horses. It'd be crazy for one to look and to say, well, look, Zechariah and Revelation are identifying the same thing, because we saw some similarities already. And as we've been looking through Zechariah and we've been comparing it to Revelation, in numerous instances, we've seen some similarities there. And so again, now without looking into it, without describing and defining what Zechariah is seeing in the book of Zechariah, in the book of Revelation, John, the Revelator, when he talks about these four horsemen that are coming forth, he's talking about the state of the church. Okay, that's what he's talking about, the state of the church. The horses there in Revelation denote the church. So it's a pure church, a persecuted church, a corrupt church, and then a deathly church or a sickly church. So Song of Solomon chapter 1 and verse 6, we can find that the horses, then they symbolize, they're represented as being a bride or being as a symbol of a woman or a church. And so we can understand that from the book of Revelation. Question that we would ask ourselves as we look in Zechariah, then, well, Zechariah is saying the same thing. Is he describing for the four states of the church? What is he talking about here in this vision that we see coming forth from these two mountains? What is he describing? Is he talking about the same thing that John sees in the New Testament and just describing it there in the Old Testament? Well, I know you're muted, so you don't be able to give much interaction as such. But we already know that from what we've studied at the book of Zechariah, that because we see something somewhere else, it does not indicate that is what is meant over in Zechariah. As a matter of fact, the vision that John sees and that which Zechariah sees, although there's similarities, they're different. These are not the same thing. So we can't go and make Zechariah a quote an end time book. There are a lot of people who want to make the minor prophets end time books. They want to almost take every story in the Bible, make it an end time story. Though there are lessons that we can learn that are certainly applicable for us, every story is not given to be a quote an end time story. And so when we look at Zechariah, in Zechariah chapter 6, even though John sees in vision and uses similar language, this is not denoting the same things. Well, you say, well, how do we know this? How do we know it's not the same thing? Because John talks about it in one way, Zechariah speaks of it another way. So how do we know that we're not describing and thus talking about the same thing? So we'll go back again to our presentation then. And once more, I do hope that you are able to see it. I think that you probably are. So as John sees and Zechariah sees, we're going to go through Zechariah's points here. But first, the four horsemen in the book of Revelation. The first one was a white horse, then there was a red, then a black horse, and then pale. And on the ones in Revelation, each one had a rider. Each one was riding, there was a rider riding the horses. And these correlated to seals, meaning the first seal opened, it was a white one. The second seal, it was red, etc. Thirdly, these were sequential. We saw them going one after the other, meaning the first seal opened, and that was all that was seen was the events described in the first seal. That one closes, the second one opens up, and then we see the events of the second one unfolding. That one ends, the third one opens, and then we see the third rider. So they are sequential, going one after the other. In comparison, when we look in the book of Zechariah, there's a red horse that is sent out first, then followed by a black, and then a white, and then dapple. So the order is changed in Zechariah. We see a different appearance that's being made there in Zechariah. Then we also notice that they're coming down from mountains in the book of Zechariah, whereas in the book of Revelation, nothing is described, the mention of mountains. Zechariah talks about they come forth from these mountains. The mountains were mountains of brass or bronze. And then lastly, we see that these are non-sequential, that they're going at the same time, just in different places. But they're not sequential as when we saw the seals opening up in the book of Revelation. So two different things that we see that are there described. Okay, so two entirely different setups. So when we look just at a surface view, we can see clean that Revelation and Zechariah are not describing the same thing. Two different deals that are being discussed and being brought to mind. Secondarily, when we go to Zechariah chapter 6, so now we'll go into it now. Let's look in Zechariah chapter 6. It says in verse 3 that the third chariot with white horses and the fourth chariot with dappled horses and strong steeds. And then it says, then answered. Oh, looks like my computer's ready to come up. Nope, not yet. Then answered I and said to the angel who talked with me, what are these, my Lord? All right, so Zechariah, he sees a vision now. These four chariots of different colors coming from these mountains of brass. And the question that he asked is, what is this? What am I seeing? What's the meaning of it? Because just because a prophet saw something didn't mean that they would understand what they saw. They have to gain understanding. So either understanding that was revealed to them by the interpreting angel, or they would go back and begin to understand and to seek to try to get some understanding. So he's asking, what is it that I have seen? What are these? It says, and the angel answered and said to me, these are the four spirits of heaven who go out from their station before the Lord of all the earth. So now to what is taking place in Zechariah. He says, what are these four chariots that I see? And he's told that these are four spirits that come forth. The word spirit there is the same as breath or wind. Okay, so four winds coming forth. And that's in the Hebrew. Four winds coming forth, or four spirits that are taking place. Okay, it says that these are the four spirits of heaven which go forth out of their station before the Lord of all the earth. Now, if you cross-reference that to the book of Daniel, chapter 8 and verse 8. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 8. So going to the book of Daniel, the 8th chapter and the 8th verse.
What was that again, Pastor?
That's Daniel chapter 8 and verse 8. Okay, so we're Daniel, the 8th chapter, and I'm almost there in verse 8. Okay, so again, the winds they represent are the same. I shouldn't say represent, but they're the same in the Hebrew as the spirits that we see. Okay, so in Daniel, the 8th chapter, in verse 8, it says, therefore the male goat grew very large, or very great, but when he became strong, the four horns, the large horn was broken. In this place where four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. So in description, then we see that there's four winds of heaven. And similar in Zechariah chapter 6, again, the same thing, that he says, these are the four spirits of heaven. So again, the word spirits and winds, when you look into Hebrew, they're both talking about the same thing, referring to the same thing. So it's not an idea of symbolism there, but simply saying then that these are four spirits of heaven, or four winds of heaven, in which we see then, if we think of the north, south, east, and west in particular, we'll see that being displayed here in Zechariah chapter 6. So what are these four winds of heaven? He says that these chariots, they representing these winds, or these agencies of heaven. Okay, it says that the one with the black horse, I'm reading in verse 6, is going to the north country. The whites are going after them, and the dappled are going toward the south country. Okay, so now you see then a couple of things that are brought up. That these horses that he sees that are going forth in vision, a black, a red, a black, a white, and then dappled or spotted. They're going to specific areas, okay? And not in this case, not to the four corners of the earth, but they're going in four different regions. He says that the one is with the black, verse 6, is going to the north country, and the white are going after them. So two of them are going to the same place. What's in the north country? Why are they going there? Well, we look on a map and we understand where Jerusalem is, or Palestine is. The northern country, or the north, is what we talk about Babylon, the king of the north. And it was called the north, not because they were, quote, north of Palestine, because they were actually, they lay to the west of Palestine. But when they would go in, they would go north, and then they would come down in their conquest. Thus, they were coming in, and they would be described as the king of the north. Okay, so when John is seeing in Revelation, he's describing, he's not talking about the same thing. As Zechariah is describing, Zechariah now has the key to unfold what's taking place. That this is talking about messengers or spirits working, and they're going to the north country. The north was Babylon, but at this particular time, Babylon had been overtaken by Persia. So rightly so, we're talking about Babylon, but more accurately, we're talking about Persia. And what is the background? The background, again, were the issues that the Hebrews are facing as they're trying to build the land. And so the assurance that they're receiving from this vision is that God is going to send angels. He's going to send reinforcement, if you please, to be able to go to the king of the north and to be able to hold him in check. Now, if you go over back to the book of Daniel, the 10th chapter, and this is a common theme that we find in Scripture, that God will send angels to be at our stead. God will send angels to assist his people. As we cry unto him, his promise is that we do not fight this battle by ourselves, but it's a spiritual battle. And then, of course, it's a spiritual battle that we need spiritual help or supernatural help. And God has then promised that not only will he send angels to be by our side, not only will he equip us, because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers, against principalities, against spiritual wickedness that exists in high places. But he also will send angels down to be able to minister. The Bible tells us that in the book of Hebrews that they are ministers sent forth to minister to them who shall be the heirs of salvation. In the 10th chapter of the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 10, it says in verse, if you read the context of it, Daniel was praying for Cyrus, that Cyrus would offer a favorable decree for the people of God. Again, similar context we're talking about in terms of the duration of the time. Now it says in verse 12, it says, and he said to me, do not fear, Daniel, or be not afraid, Daniel. For from the first day that you set your heart to and descend and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. Angels come in answer to prayer. When we pray, God hears our prayers. no matter where we are, no matter where we may be facing, no matter what we may be doing, we call upon God. God hears our prayers. He's willing to answer our prayers. And the angel says that, hey, I came down to be able to answer your prayer from the first time. If you read it in Daniel chapter 10, it was 21 days prior that the prayer had been offered, that Daniel had been praying and agonizing and fasting, that God would bring deliverance, that he would bring an answer to prayer, but the prayer, the answer to it, it had been stopped. How it had been stopped. Look in verse 13. It says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief priests, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So what the angel Gabriel is saying is that from the very first when you gave your prayer, I have been dispatched to come and to answer. But the king of Persia withstood me. At this time, the king of Persia, Cyrus, he was unwilling yet to do a favor on behalf of Israel. And he's back and forth going into his mind, not sure if he should, not sure if he should not. And because God does not force the will, he is simply allowing time now for Cyrus to decide on his own, to come under conviction, to make his choice, to make his decision. And during this time, Daniel was praying fervently that God would move upon his heart. And so God is moving upon his heart, but he's not forcing the heart. There's a difference that is there. He is impressing him. He is trying to draw him, giving him the reasons why. He's not forcing him to do it. And for a period of 21 days, is this back and forth that is there. And then you see Michael shows up on the scene, is in reinforcement, to come down to be able to get the job done, to carry it over to the task. And so be not deterred and faint not, even in most bitter circumstances and most dire straits, because if it is necessary, we understand that God will empty all of heaven than to see one of his saints go astray. So we cry out to him, God, help me. Please send more angels to help me so that I go not astray. And if necessary, then additional resources are sent at the command. And we see this in Zechariah chapter 6. So if you go back to Zechariah chapter 6, we see this being played out in Zechariah chapter 6 through this vision. It says in verse 6, again, it says, and the one with the black horses is going to the north country, and the whites are going after them. So they're going as in terms of reinforcement to them. And the dappled are going toward the south country. So they're going back in a different direction. So really what you have a picture here then is that God is giving a word to say everything is under control. Even though there have been some problems and some skirmishes and issues, it's under control. So let me read for you what we find in the Pen of Inspiration. So in the book, I think Prophets and Kings, we are. Nope, that didn't work. Let's try that one more time. Okay, now let's see it again. I think this should work. Okay. All right. So again, God was establishing that he was going to bring deliverance for his people. In Prophets and Kings, page 580, we read this. It says, for months before this decree was made, the Israelites had kept on working by faith. And not to confuse you, this is not talking about before the decree in Zechariah was made, but it's simply given the backdrop before Cyrus has come back to, Ezra and Artaxerxes had come back to give the decree in Ezra chapter 6 is what we're talking about. For months before this decree was made, the Israelites had kept working by faith. The prophets of God still helping them by means of timely messages through which the divine purpose for Israel was kept before the workers. 2 months after Haggai's last recorded message was delivered, Zechariah had a series of visions regarding the work of God in the earth. These messages, given in the form of parables and symbols, came at a time of great uncertainty and anxiety, and were of peculiar significance to the men who were advancing in the name of God, of the God of Israel. It seemed to the leaders as if the permissions to rebuild was about to be withdrawn, the future appeared very dark. God saw that his people were in need of being sustained and cheered by a revelation of his infinite compassion and love. Okay, so again, so that's what the setting is. So if you go back then, and we'll read in Ezra chapter 6, Ezra the 6th chapter, verse 7 through verse 12, in Ezra chapter 6, and verse 7 through verse 12. Ezra chapter 6, verse 7 through verse 12. This is the decree that is being referred to before the decree went forth. So again, just in setting things up, remember the Samaritans were trying to stop the rebuilding. Okay, some of the people had become discouraged with the building process, and they had left off from what we saw in Haggai. They said, the time has not yet come for us to build the temple of God. A decree seemed imminent that was going to stop again the building. If we had the whole experience with false Smyrnes, where the building had been stopped and had been resumed again, and how the Samaritans said, these people are vile and they're troublemakers. If they can build up the wall, then they're going to stop being obedient unto you. They're going to bring hardship and trouble. So the king is trying to, there's the threat that they may not be able to rebuild. And so they're praying. They're hoping for deliverance. And that's when Zechariah starts receiving, again, these visions that he begins to share. And the visions, again, I want to reiterate, these are not, quote, end-time visions. These are not visions for our day, but they're visions for his day. As with the other visions that we're seeing there, they're not, quote, last day applicable visions, but they're visions for the time in which these persons live. So I know that there are people who say, well, look, the prophets, they wrote more for our day than they did their day. And yeah, that is true, not the fulfillment of it, but the applications, the lessons that we can learn, the strength that we can face in uncertain days, when we're facing troubles, when we're facing trials, when it doesn't seem like the temple is going to be rebuilt. What lessons can we learn? Absolutely. Those are lessons that we can learn, but that's not saying that the visions as such were for our day. They were not for their day. They received them for their day to be able to encourage them, to bolster them in their day. Okay, so in the book of Ezra, the 6th chapter, and starting in verse 7 through verse 12, it says, and let the work of this house of God alone, and let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. So let this work go forth. Moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of the house of the Jews, for the building of this house of God. Let the cost be paid at the king's expense from taxes on the regions beyond the river. This is to be given immediately to these men so that they are not hindered in whatever they need, young bulls, rams, lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil according to the request of the priests who are in Jerusalem. Let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. This is again what Xerxes would reissue. And I issue a decree that whoever alters this edict, then let a timber be pulled from his house and erected, and let him be hanged on it, and let his house be made a refuse house because of this. And may the God who causes his name to dwell there destroy any king or people who put their hand to alter it and destroy this house of God, which is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. Okay, so here we see again, now, this decree had not gone forth. And because it had not gone forth, they are not sure what the outcome is. It is still hanging in limbo. What does the future hold? Will God work? Will he intervene? So Zechariah sees this vision, again, of these chariots coming forth from the mountains. And the mountains, what do they represent? Okay, they're made of brass. So we can see clearly in Zechariah chapter 6 that the chariots, they go through the earth. Some go to the north, another one goes to the south, and then there's another one that is there that the Bible says that he's just chomping at the bit, ready to go to do something for the cause of God. It says in verse 7, okay? In verse 7, it says, then the strong steeds, that was those dappled ones as well, they went out eager to go that they might walk to and fro through the earth. So they're like, okay, hey, wherever there's an issue, we're ready to lay it down. Some went to the north as to what was bothering the tidings from Palestine, others to the south. Okay, we don't know historically if there was an issue that was taking place and such in Egypt and so forth. So Okay, that would be kind of speculation on that part, right? Because we don't have anything that we can see and know. But the idea is conveyed is that simply they're going on patrol throughout the earth. That's the idea, that they're going to the north. Particularly, we know that there were issues that were there. They're going to the south. And then this other one says basically, hey, wherever you need me, I'm going to go. So they're on patrol through the earth, holding back darkness that light and truth might advance. As it particularly relates to Israel in this time, they're going back now to subdue and to hold in check the forces of darkness that will keep them from being able to build Jerusalem. Okay, so now that decree, it hasn't gone forth, but they're praying earnestly that God would prosper them, that God would give them favor. And the vision is saying, as such, this eighth vision, this eighth and final vision, that God is going to do it, that he is going to subdue and hold the nations in check. Now in verse 8, it says, and he called to me and spoke to me, saying, see, these who go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country. So again, troubles in the north, like a fire alarm is going off. They go there and they have to, this is on lockdown. Nothing's going to break out here. This is taken care of. They go to the south. Nothing's going to break out there that's going to stop the work. They're going throughout the earth. Nothing is going to break out that's going to stop the earth, the work of God in the earth. Why? Because God is sovereign. He is all powerful. No weapon that is formed against you shall prosper. So he's bringing all these things to pass in this way. Okay. So when we look at that, then as we read it, then from Zechariah chapter 6, and by the way, the mountains. What do the mountains represent? This is the place of God. Okay, that's what the mountains, Zechariah chapter 6, they represent. So so you can't go and say that, well, mountains, they represent kingdoms and so forth. And so forth. And so these are two kingdoms that are being seen here in the bronze or the brass. What does that represent? That's not the idea. The idea is already given to us, described here, that it simply represents the presence of God. That's what the mountain represents, because they're saying, hey, where'd they come from? They came from the presence of God. That was out of the mountain. So that's the explanation from it. So we don't go back now and try to, quote, interpret it based on general rules of interpretation we would use for Daniel and Revelation. So said before, Daniel and Revelation, those are outliers. One of those helps to explain the other, and they use other passages to be able to give definitions as to what they mean and the symbolism contained. When we look at these other prophecies and symbols, the answer generally and usually comes within the context of its underpinnings, that the author begins to elaborate and say, well, this is what I meant by this. Just like Jesus did when he said, what is the parable of the wheat and the tare? He says, okay, well, this is what is meant by the wheat. This is the tare. This is the harvest. He gave the answer to it, all in the undertaking of the parable. So we can see now again in this eighth and final vision that all God is saying to Zechariah is simply this: do not worry about the powers that are trying to stop the work, because my work is going to go forward and is going to be accomplished. That's the vision that's being given. These 4 chariots that are going on patrol, any uprising, I have it under control. As it seems that it is an indomitable task that is before them, that their permit is about to be revoked to build. Don't worry about it. Commit yourself to God. God is in charge of this affair. This is not a man. This is of God. Now it says in verse 9, it says, then the word of the Lord came to me saying, receive the gift from the captives from Chaldea, Tobijah, and from Jedediah, who have come from Babylon, and go to the same day and enter the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. Take the silver and gold and make an elaborate crown and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then speak to him, saying, thus saith the Lord of hosts, saying, behold, the man whose name is the branch, from his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Yea, he shall build the temple of the Lord, he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne. And so he shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. So again, just to be clear, we stopped the eighth and final vision of Zechariah in the preceding one that ended with these horses, these chariots coming from the mountain. Now there's a command that's given to go and to crown Joshua. And it speaks of three people, Heldiah, Tobijah, and Jedediah. And we have no historical reference to know who they are. So we can't see, okay, what these, who these men represent and so forth. So one would take it, okay, well, these are three persons that are going to do a symbolic act. Okay, and in this symbolic act, it says that they have come from Babylon. So meaning that they've come out of Babylon, they've escaped from captivity, they've escaped from bondage, and they enter into the house of Josiah, the son of Zephaniah. And what do? They take silver and gold to make a crown. And they put it on the head of Joshua, who is the high priest. Now, if you have been paying attention as we've been talking from week to week, we know that at least three of the main players that we see with Joshua the priest. We also see Zerubbabel, who was the governor, and we see Zechariah, the prophet. We also see Ezra, Nehemiah's cupbearers, and so forth. We see Haggai, etc. But in this particular case now, we see Joshua coming to the forefront. Now, remember we talked about Joshua, who's a high priest, who is a descendant of Aaron and so forth. That he is coming forth, and now as he is told, or he is coronated and made king. Now that doesn't happen because the kings had generally come from the line of David, okay, or either they had come from
But as we look at it now, it's saying Joshua is going to be made the king. Well, how would Joshua be made king? Well, Joshua being made king, we know then that now Joshua, the high priest, that Joshua now is a symbol.
Joshua is a symbol of Jesus. When we look in Zechariah chapter 3, when it talked about Joshua was standing filthy, he represented the people. But the priest, the high priest, depending on and the various and sundry roles, sometimes they represented the children of Israel, and sometimes they represented Jesus. And in this particular case, as the coronation takes place, it's talking about Jesus. He is a representative of Jesus now. So how can we see that? How can we be sure of that? Because it says, the silver and the gold to make an elaborate crown, speak to him these words. Behold the man whose name is the branch. Okay, so right there,
that's like a big key, for us, that he's saying to Zechariah, say to him, behold them capitalized. So we know this is something dealing with divinity. This is dealing with God. Say to the man whose name is the branch. Now go to the book of Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1. Isaiah 11th chapter and the first verse. Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1. Okay. So there, Isaiah 11 verse 1, it says, there shall come forth the rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of the counsel of might, and the Spirit of the knowledge of the fear of the Lord. And his delight will be in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by his sight, nor the sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness. He shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth, and he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist. Well, who is that talking about? Well, we know, again, obviously, and clearly, that that's talking about Jesus, right? Yeshua, talking about Jesus, the Son of God. So there's no doubt who that represents and what he represents there. So the branch. Now we go to Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5. Jeremiah 23 and verse 5. Jeremiah 23, verse 5. Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5. Jeremiah 23, verse 5. It says, behold, the days are coming, saith the Lord, says to David a branch of righteousness. I'll raise up a branch of righteousness, he says. A king shall reign and prosper and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. So again, it's a prophecy that he's going to raise up a branch of righteousness. And this branch is going to grow up out of his roots, out of the stem of Jesse, okay, out of the from David's line. Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 2. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 2. Back to Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 2. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2. It says, in that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and appealing. But those of Israel who have escaped. So again, we're talking about this branch, the branch of the Lord. Again, clearly we know then that this branch is talking about Jesus Christ, that he is the branch. Last two texts, Jeremiah chapter 33. Jeremiah 33 and verse 15. Jeremiah 33 and verse 15. All right, Jeremiah chapter 33 and verse 15, it says, in those days and at that time I will cause to grow up to David a branch of righteousness, and he shall execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. A branch of righteousness is going to grow up. A branch from the stem of Jesse. A branch of righteousness to execute and to do God's will. Jesus is being described and being prophesied is now called a branch. Another name for Jesus and talking of the function that he has. And so look over into John. He describes in terms of this tree. No, he is the vine. His people are the branches. Not in this sense of saying that they are this branch that is prophesied, but just how we are to be engrafted in. Lastly, in Zechariah, the 3rd chapter, and the 8th verse, Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 8. Again, it gives a prophecy of the coming branch. In Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 8, it says, hear, O Joshua, the high priest, you and your companions who sit before me, for they are a wondrous sign. For behold, I am bringing forth my servant, the branch. Okay, so again, a prophecy about bringing forth this servant, the branch. We know again that this servant, the branch to be brought forth, is none other than Jesus. It is a prophecy indicating that Jesus is going to come forth. So when we go back and we consider again what we're reading in Zechariah, let's try to put it back into perspective now. After this 8th vision is over, God is saying again that he's going to accomplish in this work of rebuilding. The temple is going to take place. It's going to go forth. No power on earth can stop it. Then it says that the 3 men, Heldiah, Tobijah, and Jedediah, they're going to come from Babylon. They're going to coronate Joshua, and they're going to make him king with these instruments of silver and gold. They're going to make an elaborate crown and set it upon his head. And it says in verse 12 again, that they will speak to him saying, behold, the man whose name is the branch, from his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. So he is going to do this. Is going to be brought to pass. Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord, he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne. Again, not talking about Joshua, but now this is a type of foreshadowing of the work that Jesus is going to do. So again, not to be misunderstood, Joshua the priest was going to be successful in building the temple, okay? But the context of what it's talking about here, this further fulfillment, is talking about Jesus Christ. When we know it again clearly in verse 13, that he's going to sit on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. We know again that's talking about the Father and the Son. So clearly again, the work of God is being championed here. Jesus is being foreshadowed. He is the branch that is going to bring all these things to pass. So the work of God is going to be fulfilled. And what it's saying now in this vision is that it's bigger than building the temple. Okay, the temple is only one aspect. But the bigger glory is that Jesus is going to come. And not only is he going to come and live on the earth, not only is he going to come to the temple, but in the future, this is the future prospect. He's going to set up his throne and live and reign out of Jerusalem forever and ever and ever. That's the idea that's being brought to bear. So it's going to buoy up their spirits, and as they look and they see that their temple is still in ruins. They look around, they see that their city, their beloved city, is being overrun. They're uncertain about what the future holds. The prospect looks bleak. This is an encouraging word that God has given to them. Don't look down at physical appearances, but look to me as your unseen God, and I will do great and wonderful things to you. I'm going to do these things through you. I'm going to do these things by you because I have covenanted with you, and I will not alter my word. Nor am I going to break the thing that has been gone forth from my lips. So this council of people, eternity before man was created, but what Zechariah here is speaking of within its context then is that the plan of God is going to be laid out. It's going to be brought to pass. No power again is going to be able to stop it. Verse 14, in closing says, and now the elaborate crown shall be for a memorial in the temple of the Lord. Even those from far off shall come and build the temple of the house of the Lord, and then you shall know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me to you, and this shall come to pass if you will diligently hearken and obey the voice of the Lord your God. So he's going to build this temple. This branch is going to build it. Josiah is going to build it. Now, we certainly have to talk about the implication that it would make, because it also denotes then the future work of the Messiah, of the branch, that he is going to build this spiritual house. Okay, now go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Just a few more texts in closing. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and in verse 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 and verse 17. And I'll read that for us. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So bigger plan does this foreshadow. Not simply the building of the physical temple upon the earth, but the future building of a spiritual temple, of which you and I are a part of. Who's doing the building? Jesus is. Who are the stones that are being put in place? You and I are. Right? Peter talks about these lively stones or living stones that are being brought forth, being put up in this spiritual temple that is being built. How is it being shaped and fashioned? It's being hewn out by the word of God to put us in place, to place us in. It looks like the work may not be accomplished, but have no fear. The angels of God are going to the earth, to the north, to the south, here and there, looking to see what's taking place. And they say, hey, this can't stop the work of God. There's no problem. There's no sin that is too great that can stop the completion. It looks bleak like it may not happen. But if you will look to me, surrender to me, put your trust in me, and to cooperate with my agencies, I'm sending reinforcement to get it done. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, Paul says, what, know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man will defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple we are. So we are this spiritual temple. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19 and verse 22. Ephesians 2, verses 19 through verse 22. Paul here it says that now therefore ye are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and the members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building is being fit together, grows into the temple of the Lord. So we're built in this building, this temple that is made with Jesus being the chief cornerstone. The apostles and the prophets, they've laid this foundation, and we can only build on the foundation with the sure word of God. He's putting us in. He intends then that this temple, this house be built, a house devoted to him, a house that is now consecrated to him, filled by his presence and built by his goodness. That is you and I. And lastly, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 3 through verse 5. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 3 through verse 5. Peter says that if ye have indeed tasted that the Lord is gracious, choosing to come to him as unto a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God, and precious. And ye also as lively stones, being built up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices to God acceptable through Jesus Christ. So just as Joshua was promised that he would build this house and it would be crowned with success, so Jesus has been promised that he is going to build this spiritual house. And this spiritual house is going to be crowned with success. You and I are the physical emblems that he places there. The people of the world he's calling out to build within this spiritual temple. His work will be fulfilled. It's going to be accomplished. And so, again, by appearances, it may look as though, how will it ever happen? But he's told us through the prophecies of Zechariah. It's not by might nor by power, but it's by my spirit. I am in control. I'm going to bring these things to pass. It's going to be crowned with success. And so Zechariah's messages are still, in that respect, applicable for us. Don't look to ourselves. Don't give up because it seems difficult. Don't throw in the towel because it seems bleak. But give in the towel, throw in the towel on ourselves. But never, never, ever give up upon God. Never choose to believe that he will not be able to bring this to pass. Remember that no matter what the enemy places to stop the work of God, that it cannot stop God's work. As we pray to him, where he's reminding us of the lessons, he will send additional forces and reinforcement and empty all heaven if necessary to be able to bring to pass his glorious and prosperous plan, because it's going to work and it shall be seen. And so Zechariah ends as well, we would say, in the eighth vision. And then there's the future take place when Messiah comes, when Messiah sets up, and when Messiah begins to rule and to reign. And so we'll stop here at the conclusion there and pray, and I'll open up in case there are a couple of questions this morning. Okay. Father in heaven, we thank you again for the time we've been able to just study again this last chapter that we just looked at in Zechariah and these different visions. Just gives us some hope and confidence in you that your work is going to go forward. And so where it looks like it is stalled in our lives because we have been distracted by the Samaritans, we've been distracted by our own building, we come back to you and we hear your word that you want to carry it forth and bring it to completion. And so because you've called us to be lively stones built into the spiritual temple, I pray that you would please separate us from the world through the mighty cleaver of truth and purify us to yourself. Let us be built upon that foundation and upon the chief cornerstone, Jesus Christ. You said that as rocks that we will come, that we can fall upon you, and that we will be broken. But if the rock will fall on us, it's going to grind us to powder. So I pray, God, that you would help us to fall upon you and to be broken, that we could be used and built up in your kingdom. Please keep us again this day, I pray, and may your grace and your favor rest upon us always. It's our prayer in Jesus' name.